there are two ways an asset can be identified in the contract. First, by explicit identification of the asset, where the contract mentions an asset, and provide a description of it. For example, a contract states that a customer has the right to use a vehicle of a particular type, and mentions its specifications. That is an explicit form of asset identification. The second way is by implicit identification of the asset, where the asset is identified at the time it is made available for use by the customer. It is not explicitly mentioned in the contract. For example, a contract with an air freight company, the supplier, to transport goods for a customer by air to some destination. The contract does not specify any airplane. However, the supplier has only one airplane that can be used to fulfill the customer's contract. In addition, the contract does not allow the supplier to outsource other airplanes from other suppliers to fulfill the contract. Here in this example, although the contract does not specify any airplane, there is an implicit identification of the supplier's only airplane, because the supplier has no other airplane except his own to fulfill the contract, and the contract does not allow the supplier to outsource other airplanes from the market. Now, what if there was no explicit or implicit identification of the asset in the contract? Let us assume in our previous example, that the transportation service of the goods by air is all what the contract talks about. No explicit or implicit identification is made of the airplane that will be used to fulfill the customer's contract. The supplier is free to fulfill the contract with either his own airplane, or an outsourced one. The customer doesn't care. All what the customer wants is to receive the service contracted for. Here, the contract is a service contract and not a lease contract, because there is no identified asset, and therefore, IFRS 16 will not be applicable here. Sometimes the asset that is to be used by the customer is not the full asset, but only a portion of it. Can we consider that portion an identified asset? For example, a contract between a customer and a supplier, where the customer is granted the right to use 3 individually specified fibers within a cable made of 20 fibers. IFRS 16 states that, if that portion of the asset is physically distinct, or physically identified, then the portion of the asset is an identified asset. Here in this example, the 3 fibers the customer has the right to use are individually specified, and therefore, they are considered an identified asset. Let us change the previous example a little bit, and assume that the contract granted the customer the right to use, for example, 10% of the capacity of the fiber cable. Here, the contract did not physically specify the fibers to be used by the customer. In this case, the standard directs us to check whether that specified capacity represents substantially all the capacity of the asset. If the specified capacity represents substantially all the capacity of the asset, then we have an identified asset in the contract. Otherwise, there is no identified asset in the contract. In our example, 10% is not a substantial portion of the capacity of the fiber cable, so it is not an identified asset, and therefore, we have no lease in the contract, it is just a service contract. Now please check the following quiz.